Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Blockchain Socialist podcast. And for today's interview, I have Murtaza Hussain. He's a reporter for The Intercept, focused on foreign affairs, and he has quite an interest in cryptocurrency, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So, yeah, maybe for starters, Murtaza, can you give us, the audience, a bit of an introduction to yourself, your reporting interests, and how you got interested in cryptocurrency in the first place? I mean, just considering there's been a lot of news, in the foreign affairs world about all these different countries that are avoiding economic sanctions using cryptocurrencies. So yeah, curious to hear your perspective.
Sure, absolutely. I've been a reporter for The Intercept for about almost 8 years now, and prior to that, I wrote for other outlets, mainly focused on U.S. foreign policy and geopolitical conflict in the Middle East and beyond. And one thing I came to realize over the years is that economic warfare is such a integral part of what we consider war as a totality, and in the United States has used sanctions and other forms of economic coercion to pursue foreign policy uh, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in East Asia for many, many decades now. In many cases, the humanitarian impacts of that have been as bad or worse of other forms of direct military intervention in these societies. Now, that's one thing I also have in the back of my mind, the sanction campaign on Iraq and now today Iran and Cuba and other countries and the impact it's had over the years. But secondly, I'm also very much a believer in the internet, in the sense that the internet is very important. It's a very important force for decentralizing power and information generally. And a lot of my the connections I've gained over the years being a journalist and the flattening of hierarchies that allowed me to make those connections was because of the advent of social media. And so some time ago I started learning about blockchain and cryptocurrency and just what it is exactly, and how it affects, or how it can potentially have the same flattening impact on economic life that social media did on political and cultural life. And it struck me as quite almost inevitable that there'll be bumps around along the road, but this technology is going to have as big an impact as the advent of the internet did in the first place, and it's going to be in many ways the next stage of the internet, and it may actually level the playing field politically, domestically in the U.S. and in Western countries, but also between countries, because as I said earlier, economic coercion is such an important part of how states exercise power over smaller states. And if that global economic system can be decentralized further, that sort of, those sort of campaigns will be less effective or less possible in the future. And as you mentioned, there are already countries in the very early phases of what blockchain and crypto are, which are using these tools to escape from under the dragnet of U.S. control over SWIFT and other
Mhm.
means of choking their access off to
Maybe
global
could you
finance.
give when you say that the internet has had like a decentralizing effect in terms of like social media and in that area, like how, like I guess like I what's very funny to me is that I mean, you obviously work at the Intercept, and you know Glenn Greenwald, and it was wild to me that through Twitter, like Glenn Greenwald retweeted me, and like that sounds like such a like a ridiculous like stupid little thing, but it's also like, if we didn't have the internet, Glenn Greenwald probably would have never seen my my I don't know what the equivalent of a blog is or podcast back in pre-internet days, but you probably wouldn't have seen it.
Dude, it's amazing. Like, I have had access to people who are like super smart and super connected, who I never in a million years, like without the internet, would have ever had touch with or been able to learn from or been able to develop networks with. Now I just find the smartest person on Twitter or ever any website, and I try and like I read their stuff and I learn from them, and maybe I can develop a relationship with them. So you said like we get like there's just an unbelievable flattening of hierarchies and collapsing of geographic boundaries and class boundaries as well, which is possible online. Which is not to say that not to like paper over the negative impacts of tech companies' control over so much information, or sort of like the profiling and other things which are possible. We should also, it's an amazing thing. It's just unbelievable. And if this technology existed in generations past, I think a lot of human potential would not have been wasted as it has been, especially in the developing world, or people who are poorer in Western countries who just lack access to, social capital. The internet, if you use it properly, it's just an incredible tool for that, for having those connections, and the novelty of being retweeted by somebody who's really big, like like a tech CEO or a very famous journalist, or inventor or a politician or something like that. It's something we take for granted at times now, but it is quite remarkable just for what it suggests about the flattening of information hierarchies.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, without it, we couldn't like bully billionaires online over Twitter or something like that if we wanted to, or like, I mean, it's crazy how like, I mean, you can see a little bit, you get a better idea of sentiment, I guess, potentially, depending on how much you consider Twitter real life when you see a bunch of people shitting on, Kamala Harris's tweets about whatever or something.
Dude, before this, if you wanted to criticize something in a newspaper, or like by a very ivory tower newspaper columnist or something, what your options are: writing a letter to the editor
Yeah,
and like
yeah.
hoping they print it one day, which they probably won't if it's depending how scathing it is and damning it is a publication. Now, I mean, you have a lot more control. You can like tell David Frum, whoever else, that they're wrong about X, Y, and Z, and they can't unless you're banned from the platform for violating some red line. Like, they can't really, like, it's free speech. It's like
Yeah.
the gatekeeping capacity is gone. So that was just amazing to me when I realized like how that had happened. And blockchain, like very well, and I'm in the process of learning, educating myself about this as well too. Blockchain, I think, is another way of removing the gatekeeping function of other old institutions. Like in the old industrial society, had very centralized
Mm.
institutions for media, for politics, and for economic activity. And the first two of those, I think, have been thoroughly decentralized, or in the process of thorough decentralization and the removing of gatekeepers. Like media is very permeable as a field now. Anyone produces content, or everyone has the power of CNN in their pocket, basically. With CNN only had 20 years ago, broadcast and things like that. Politics, like, because of the fact that this change of the information environment, we see lots of
Mm.
political candidates who may have been not possible under the old model. They would have been gate kept out, and some of them are good, some of them
Yeah.
are bad, but they're all have more access than before. But economics and finance is still as gate kept as it was ever by these gigantic, lumbering financial financial institutions, both domestically in the U.S. internationally. But we can have our own permissionless money of various sorts with various programmability, or it's decentralized, it's maintained collectively by us, then that gatekeeping power will inevitably, in my view, start to erode. And
Yeah.
we'll see the last pillar of the old industrial society, the banks and their foreign branches, start to lose its stranglehold over all of us.
No, which is a potentially like scary thought considering how deeply ingrained, I mean, banks are. If you believe like if you believe that narrative, then it can be quite a scary thing, maybe.
I think all the changes that have happened in the last 20 years have been like quite unnerving. Like some of them are good, in my opinion. They've benefited like the little people, but they're unnerving. Like you told me Donald Trump was going to be president in 2016. And you told me that in 2008, or any time before that. I would have been like, that would be a very unnerving thought. And it did happen. And I think we're going to see many more disruptions as a result of internet information chaos. But the disruptions of decentralization, economic decentralization, could dwarf that potentially. That's why I think we should prepare for it. We should learn about it, and we should try to shape it in a way which reflects our values, as opposed to, in my opinion, futilely hoping that it just goes away or can be regulated out of existence. And if we don't use all the tools at our disposal, we're going to find that people who, with different visions of society, monopolize those tools and perhaps use them to enact a social order we don't find desirable. If only, it's very interesting. When the Arab Spring first started, it was very interesting. There was a lot of discourse about. It was very optimistic, a
Mm.
techno optimist time still in 2011. And it's the people who mobilized in Egypt and a few other countries, Tunisia, using social media at first. They were more a very liberal slant. There were liberal activists who were using it, and it sort of like gave a suggestion, which already seemed to be latent in the U.S., that these technologies had inherently liberal bias to them. And what we found actually is like, later like things changed and like other sectors of society got online and started using it. And then, the narrative flipped, like these technologies maybe have an inherently right wing bias to them. I think neither of those things is true. It's just that, they're sort of politically neutral in a sense, but you can use them for different ends. And, what would happen if, blockchain becomes very important, like social media has undeniably become now? But left wing people just decide we're not going to use it. Like right wing people can get all educated about it. They can build, their own networks. They can build tools and protocols. But we're just like, against it. We're not going to use it, and we're going to effectively forfeit this technology to other people. Like if the left had just forfeit social media, or did forfeit social media only to the right, or vice versa, the right did to the left, there would be a huge power discrepancy that accrued over time because of that. Thankfully, that didn't happen, and there's like a battle going on, an ongoing. But we cannot neglect to look ahead to what the next likely sphere of political disputation is going to be technologically.
Yeah, definitely agreed. It's sort of like it's crazy how so many things have become like aestheticized and like politicized in that process. Just like yeah, blockchain is right wing, therefore it is like not something that we should approach. Whereas, I mean, even if you think that it is right wing, it should be something that you should at least try to understand a little bit more deeply than maybe you're giving it credence to for some people.
I think what's happened is that the first sector of society, which seemingly took up Bitcoin, were very libertarian leaning, and Bitcoin is the original blockchain and so forth. So it gave a characterization, just like the Arab Spring initially gave a characterization that social media was initially originally like inherently left leaning. But though that's just like a mischaracterization based on the sector of society which adopted first. So I can understand why people have that view, and I also had that view. Like I also, when I didn't know much about it, that was my initial take, that this must be like a very inherently right wing or libertarian thing. And you have big personas like Elon Musk and things like that who people are skeptical of. One on the more progressive side, who seem to be enamored with it, Peter Thiel. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's just like something that it's, well, I wouldn't say it's completely a neutral technology, but it's technology that structures the world in a certain way, and it can be structured in different ways or programmed in different ways, in ways that reflect your values. But the important thing is a vessel for power and for the wielding and maintenance of power, and to shape the world a certain way. And we cannot neglect all the tools which are available to us if we want to have a chance in the 21st century.
But maybe before we go deeper into the crypto stuff, I think it would be good to start off. If you could explain a bit more of some of the things that you've noticed in your reporting experience when it comes to, especially American and Western imperialism, and how imperial power exerts itself on these countries that the U.S. government doesn't like, especially when it comes to economic violence. Like, what does that look like?
Sure, let me give you two illustrative examples. Like there are so many examples throughout U.S. history in the 20th century, but two of the most resonant and particularly relevant to our generation are Iraq, and then after that, Iran. So Iraq, at one time it was ruled by Saddam Hussein, who was a very cruel dictator, and it was a very authoritarian state. It was during that time, there was a level of economic warfare waged not just against the government of Iraq, but against the entire society of Iraq by the United States, which approached catastrophic levels of harm to the Iraqi society, which at one time was a very relatively middle class society with good healthcare and education. It was also the most secular society in the Middle East. It was known that for that long time, which ironically now I think is a relationship to the fact that that's also produced ISIS later on after all this calamities occurred there. But effectively, it was reduced from a middle class society into a very poor society, and there was so much political legitimacy at that time to this sort of use of indiscriminate sanctions. People didn't have food, they didn't have access to medicine. It was a very vindictive campaign of sanctions in the end, and the Iraqi people really had no recourse to how to defend themselves against this. On one hand, There was a government which was known to be quite corrupt and exploitative. On the other hand, there was international community and a global financial system which was completely under the hegemony of the United States, which did not care for the well-being of Iraqis as evidenced by its actions. And there are studies, the UN, others that estimate huge numbers of excess deaths in Iraq as a result of these sanctions. Some of those studies have been called into question in later years, but undeniably there was very significant and severe suffering and deprivation and the denial of opportunity to innocent people in Iraq as a result of a foreign country which did not like their government and seemed to be laying down ultimatum that you can either overthrow this government, which we acknowledge is very violent and brutal, yourselves somehow, and we won't help you with that, as what happened with the 1991 uprising in Iraq, or you can just continue to live under increasingly harsh deprivation to the point of medicine and very necessary uh, goods needed for daily life were very hard to get into Iraq. So we saw this play out over the course of many years and culminated with the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, which furthered the destruction of the country, did not rectify the harms of the previous era, and we see what Iraq is today. Now, another example is Iran. So Iran, like Iraq, was an oil-producing state or is an oil-producing state. They've been under various degrees of sanctions by the U.S. for many years. It also is a very repressive government, an unpopular government in Iran. But under the Obama administration, there was a progression of this halting attempt to reach some sort of détente in the U.S. And the first effort of that was in 2003, when the U.S. rejected the first entreaties from Iran and deemed it part of the axis of evil. There was an attempt to sort out the nuclear issue and sort of make it a stepping stone to further negotiations about U.S.-Iranian relations and Iran's position in the Middle East. The deal was signed. It was quite a successful multilateral effort when European, American, and Iranian negotiators, and Russia and China are involved as well too. And the U.S., after it signed this deal, they elected Donald Trump. It was very surprising. It's a black swan event in U.S. political life. Some would say at the time. I think that more disruptions like that are possible or likely in the future, but it's something unexpected. And the U.S. decided to completely renege on the agreement that it just signed and reimpose the harshest sanctions ever possible on Iran. And now Iran ended up, deprived of many of the same things the Iraqis were. But then Iran also became one of the first countries to be hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And during that time, the U.S. refused to waive humanitarian or allow humanitarian medical supplies and goods to reach Iran. They continued to step up their sanctions campaign during this time. COVID became reached epidemic levels in Iran, or sorry, critical pandemic levels in Iran, and tens of thousands of people died directly from the disease. The disease metastasized and spread throughout the world because we're all in it together in some sense. We're dealing with a pathogen. And there was never any accountability for any of this. There was never any real accounting for it. And, now the new administration is coming. They may temporarily, for a few years until the next Donald Trump is elected, remove these sanctions. But if you're a country which is on bad terms with the U.S. or you have disputes with the U.S., you always have the anvil over your head that, this gigantic mechanism of financial deprivation could be dropped upon you. And I just use Iran and Iraq as two very resonant examples, but there are other examples in Latin America and elsewhere. And regardless of what one thinks about U.S. foreign policy or the foreign policies of countries that are at odds with the U.S., it's not really fair, the system. It's a system which was created after World War II when the U.S. was at the apex of its power. They sort of embedded themselves into the global financial system as the U.S. dollar as the preeminent currency for its administration and all its infrastructure going along with that. And if the U.S. elects some crazy person, which they do periodically, and they seem to be likely to do in the future, you could have a whole country which is just cut off from the most basic access to economic goods. And I do not think that other countries in the world will accept this indefinitely. It's a great task to sort of get away from the dollar because there's all this dead weight and inertia in the system as it exists. But the more that the dollar is used as an economic weapon in the Middle East or elsewhere, Russia or other countries, I just think other countries will inevitably find ways to innovate themselves out from under that. And I do think that we're seeing today, there's some reports that 4% of all Bitcoin mining is done in Iran at the moment. I think that this is an early sign that there are other countries, the way that they get away from that post World War II U.S. superpower system is to innovate out from under it. And blockchain is likely to be an integral tool in doing that, I expect.
It might be interesting to know that I will soon actually be interviewing someone who lives in Iran, who's really big in the cryptocurrency community there, to get his perspective.
Mm.
But yeah, I guess in the middle of all this is like the U.S. dollar. I mean, I think you probably know pretty well that the U.S. dollar sort of, or the U.S. uses its dollar as like a proxy for exerting imperial, influence and power. But maybe could you explain a bit like how does it do that? Like how is the U.S. dollar used as a weapon? I guess.
Sure. So the US dollar is the currency of international trade, and the US has what French foreign minister called once the exorbitant privilege of being able to print currency which other countries all over the world need to compete with goods and services to obtain to use as their currency of international trade for. Actually, it's the reserve currency of the world, and it's unbelievable power the US.
It is that way because there are like these agreements that the U.S. was able to basically create agreements between other countries who were struck by World War just right before then and didn't have really, I guess, much other choice but to accept the U.S. dollar as a world currency. Is that right?
Yeah, so the process kind of started post World War One, but it of course accelerated World War Two when European countries, which at that time were the preeminent powers in the world, were completely at the mercy of the US, or they're laid waste by the World War Two, but they became very, very dependent on the US thereafter. The previous global reserve currency was actually the pound sterling, the UK pound sterling, and the dollar replaced that. So, what happened is that, you have a currency which is backed by the force. Like like people ask, well, what backs Bitcoin? And what backs Bitcoin is the energy expenditure of the network and the energy which is expended to maintain it, to verify transactions, to validate blocks. The U.S. dollar is a competing global reserve currency, or is the global reserve currency, and it's backed by force. So you can say that why won't people stop using the U.S. dollar and start using something else? Well, there's like armed military bases and tanks and aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons, which are all backing to people continue using this as a global reserve currency. And of course, there's some faith that's stable and the U.S. will not devalue to such a point that it impacts others around the world. But it's ultimately it's at the bottom of the social order stands a hangman. That's sort of like the saying about society on a domestic scale. It's also true on an international scale. At the bottom of it is the U.S. Army and the Air Force and Navy. So post World War II, the strongest power in the world was the U.S. It had the ability to compel other countries to use its currency as a global reserve currency, the currency of international trade, and that situation still obtains today. So, if in the U.S., if you want to get more dollars, you can just print more dollars. The U.S. government can print more dollars, but other countries cannot print more dollars. Like they need dollars to settle international trade for their deficits. The U.S. can run permanent deficits in its global international trade because they just keep printing more money to get out of it. And if other countries need that, they need to actually sell goods to the U.S. to get this thing that the U.S. can make out of thin air. And this obviously affords an unbelievable amount of power to the U.S. Some say that the level of power is exaggerated because it's incentivizes a lot of hot air in the U.S. economy, or financialization of the U.S. economy because people do not have to make things anymore. They can just a lot of like fluff going around. I think there's some truth to that, but ultimately, for U.S. elites, it's a great power. It's an unbelievable power to be able to do this, and they benefit from this accordingly. But it's a very politicized when a country like I don't know, Sudan wants to trade with Argentina. They want to make some transaction. The U.S. nothing to do with this. They have to use the U.S. currency and U.S. structures which are susceptible to vulnerable of U.S. political pressure if they don't like that sort of, if they don't want them to transact. It's a very politicized system which puts a certain circle of U.S. elites at the center of it. Now, I don't think that other countries, now that the World War II and the post-Cold War superpower moment is waning more and more, I don't see other countries accepting this. Why would they accept this permanently as while their relative power rises inevitably and the US relative power decreases? They're going to find other ways of doing it. And I don't think necessarily that, I'm not saying that Bitcoin is going to be the tool of international trade, although some banks are speculating that could be something possible in the future. But something is going to be it. I think that there's going to be a replacement, and I also don't think it's going to be the yuan. I don't think it's necessarily going to be that. It's not going to be another superpower replacing them. I think it could be, and I would desire it to be a politically neutral currency for the conducting of international trade. Again, it could be a different one. It could be some other currency developed for that purpose. But the idea that the U.S. dollar is going to continue being the global reserve currency of the entire world indefinitely strikes me as unlikely, and I think it's an area of global affairs which is ripe for disruption by new technologies birthed online.
So I guess it's from like a really really practical sense. At least how I understand it is that well, banks have like really they have like a huge departments where they make sure that transactions aren't being made with countries that are under economic sanctions from the U.S. I know this for a fact. They have to be sure that if the U.S. has released put another country on the list that they say are under sanctions, then banks have to be able to be sure that their clients aren't doing business with that country as much as possible as they can. But so then yeah, so it's because the US has such hegemony over the financial system, over banks that are not American. Countries cannot use their banks to interact with each other if they're both under economic sanctions, and which I guess is how we end up now to something like Bitcoin.
So after the Iran deal, the Iran nuclear deal, which the European countries invested a lot of time and political capital in negotiating, they were very happy about this deal. It was viewed as a triumph of European diplomacy. And suddenly Donald Trump was elected, and the U.S. decided, no, like, F you, we're tossing us out the window. You can't do it, XYZ. So Europeans were very antagonized by this. And unfortunately, there's not much they could do about it. It was like a slap in the face because the U.S. very much threatened to sanction European companies which continue to try to do business with Iran. And very heavy possible fines and penalties. They fined but to tune of billions of dollars European companies in the past for doing business with Iran. I believe UK Standard Chartered Bank was one of those. And effectively, it was a show of brute force on the part of the Americans that they, any crazy thing that happens in the U.S. in domestic politics, completely bizarre, random candidates come about, they can totally throw off any other country's ability to do diplomacy. Europeans are very afraid, for a number of reasons. The Middle East for the Europe is like what Latin America is to the United States in the sense that it's their near abroad. So if there's massive destabilization in the Middle East, it's going to affect Europe in a very tangible way. It doesn't affect America that much. They're buffeted by these giant oceans. Something they may take an interest in. They may be interested in Israel, but they're not. It's not like a 0 hour emergency if Iran or Iraq blows up for the average American. For European, if Iran collapses, if it could have a devastating effects on Europe. We saw what happened in Syria led to a gigantic refugee crisis in Europe, which had significant political impacts on European societies. So, they're very interested in avoiding anything like that and just having some sort of possible sustainable order. Whether that's the Iran deal or not, it's a question for debate, but they believe it is. So when the U.S. just showed that it has this economic trump card because of its ability to sanction other countries which use the U.S. dollar for transactions, it was just a very humbling moment. And the Europeans tried to develop this other alternative mechanisms to try to like engage in secret trade with the Iranians. Instex was one of them, but it was like the success of those endeavors is sort of up for debate. What was demonstrated is that the U.S. has completely the kingpin of international trade, and everyone presently is subject to consequences as a result of U.S. domestic political outcomes. Now, to bring it back to Bitcoin, just to use an example, the most famous and preeminent cryptocurrency with the largest network effect at present, if someone wanted to sanction other people's use of Bitcoin, they couldn't do that. If Bitcoin was the currency for international trade, you can't really stop people from using it the way you can stop people from using the US dollar. You can try, you can sanction individual wallet addresses, you can try to track down individual users, you can try to, shut down the hash rate in certain areas, but it's very difficult. It's much, much harder than it is the US dollar, which you have total control over. And I think it's not even possible really in the end to, when there's a will to use Bitcoin, then you can do it. So I think that's it's a fair form of economic exchange. And it's not dependent upon, first of all, the use of force by the US military at the bottom of the structure. It's dependent on the energy expenditure. And it's not subject to, there's no like president of Bitcoin. There's no Bitcoin, Senate or Congress that some people control and they can use to bend to their own political will. It's a very neutral technology. It's a neutral currency, and we've never had permissionless neutral currency, which is also international and accessible to anyone in the world with a phone before. And again, I'm not an apologist for Bitcoin. Like I think that there are criticisms of it which are valid, and I don't think it's impossible that another blockchain-based cryptocurrency potentially could play the same role. I do think that the underlying technology is brilliant, and it does actually solve that problem.
Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. So if you're enjoying the interview or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out and join the newest patrons like Tom, Alexander, and Barry. Any amount really helps since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. And as a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode like I just did, and access to Patreon exclusive content like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. In the last Patreon Q&A episode, I take a deeper look into the concept of decentralization versus centralization in software and how that could apply to a socialist politics. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain does not need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. Also, if you're interested in what's been going on lately at BreadChain, which is the project that I've been working on with a few others from the community, be sure to check out the latest blog post that was published a couple of weeks ago as it goes into more detail about our first application to be put to production, called the BreadChain Crowd Staking Protocol, which is meant to be the engine for funding post-capitalist projects on blockchain. But that's it from me. Let's get back to the interview with Murtaza. Yeah, I think as in terms of like neutrality, it's neutral, I would say, in the sense of access. It made like I think there are definitely like there's an argument to be made that Bitcoin, as it's designed, isn't meant for like a very like left friendly economy, in the sense that like hard currency, like very hard currency, I think doesn't really it doesn't really help the working class so much, or it as a hard currency, it's sort of like the people who take out loans get screwed over more than people who give out loans in this type of currency model, as far as I understand, in terms of monetary systems. But in terms of access, anybody can do it, and that's something that's very important and very interesting, and needs to be capitalized on.
Yeah, a lot of the perception that Bitcoin is right wing, it comes because the fact that a lot of the proponents of Bitcoin on the economic side are like they're enamored with the gold standard and you know these sort of like deflationary currencies. And one thing I realize like about economists is that they don't all agree. Like they don't agree. Like
It's not a science at all. Anyone who thinks that economics is a science is a bullshitting.
yeah, exactly. I studied economics and like that was my like educational background. I just like this is like this is very political,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah,
So and the questions are not like mathematically provable or settlable. They're matters of opinion and things like that, and that's good. And like some of the people who make like interesting points, the pro Bitcoin people who are more of that view, like I think Saifuddin Ammous wrote that book, The Bitcoin Standard, which is very influential, and it does have a kind of like a Austrian school economics sort of
for sure. Yeah.
framing to it. And I think that there is like that is a legitimate like I see why left wing people would be like not attracted to that, but I think that that doesn't detract from the accessibility argument of blockchain-based cryptocurrencies, which
Sure, yeah.
could be programmed in different ways. They could have different economic theories underlying them. And secondly, we don't have to be maximalists. So you don't have to be like there's only one currency in the world. Everyone has to use Bitcoin, and that's it. We'll likely live in a world with multiple currencies. And the U.S. dollar will not go away, and Bitcoin probably won't go away. There could be other currencies that reflect, different sort of economic theories and values which exist alongside it, to preserve the good things we like about the accessibility and the freedom of access and the political neutrality of Bitcoin, for instance. And I think that would be a fruitful avenue for people who are more left-leaning or progressive-minded to explore, even if they don't like Bitcoin, if they don't think Bitcoin itself is not a superior. Like, if you told me tomorrow we're gonna get rid of the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Bank, U.S. dollar, and all use Bitcoin for our daily transactions, I'm not like a maniac. I would pause and be like, I think it's a good idea. But I do think that it's not like the technology is interesting. It's not technology useful, interesting, and we have to have creative and heterodox sort of solutions to our problems of just today.
One of the things that I think a lot of left people are they're falling for the maximalist argument and sort of taking it at face value as if as the only as the opinion about Bitcoin or about cryptocurrency or about blockchain. They look at the surface of Saifedean Amis's type of arguments, and they take it at face value, and they don't really I think they're not putting in enough analysis into it. They're not going deep enough into it to you got to sift through the shit to find maybe what is kind of interesting. And yeah, of course, no socialist should be at least for me, a socialist should not be a maximalist when it comes to any specific cryptocurrency, because it's just
yeah, there's this network effect, this information effect whereby we just take the most insane argument of the other side. Everyone does this.
Yeah.
It's not unique and progressives. Writing people do it. Everyone does it. Take the most craziest argument from the people on the other side. Not say that Tiffany was crazy. It's just most extreme arguments from Bitcoin Twitter or the Bitcoin pro-Bitcoin writers or activists, and conflate that with the totality of what the thing is. Not bother to understand the technology or anything like that. Just sort of do that, and others do that too. The people denigrating fiat, quote unquote, as a bad thing, and talking about fiat media and things like this. It's a little there's a lot of extremism that sort of foments about it. The thing that I find I want to tell people about, though, is that let's just not think about Bitcoin as a currency primarily. It is the currency which runs on the blockchain, but let's think about it as a technology platform that you can build different things on. Ethereum is a technology platform you can build different things on. The price of these currencies actually doesn't really matter that much. It's not really that important beyond the fact that it attracts attention. What's interesting is what you can do with it. What can you actually build on these things?
Yeah.
And you can build different things which reflect different people's values. The Bitcoin blockchain, a currency was built upon it, which was finite and deflationary, and it reflected the values of Satoshi and the people who liked it originally and who continue to adopt it. We can build different currency on the blockchain. We can build we can build organizations on the blockchain. We can build decentralized autonomous organizations. We can build ways of cooperating and sharing resources, or transparently sharing and preserving information on the blockchain that are not beholden to certain centralized corporate oligarchs or governments and things like that. It's actually a possibility for very radical change in organization using this tool. So, it's so interesting. It's because it seems Liz Warren has very, negative comments about crypto generally a few days ago. And some right-wing governors in the U.S. have been sort of encouraging adoption of Bitcoin. They've been trying to
they're joining the politicization of it, which I think is very interesting.
Exactly.
It's becoming more and more that Bitcoin's right wing, so I need to support Bitcoin. Or at least that's how it maybe feels like. Why these governors are sort of jumping in on it.
Totally, it's becoming a Republican versus Democrat thing. There's one exception, which I think is Ro Khanna, who's very knowledgeable about tech, more so because where he's based.
Yeah.
But I think that this is actually concerning to me a little bit as somebody whose political sympathies are more left of center, is because if it becomes that way and we just decide that this technology, one group of people likes it, the other people don't, and just tracks our a reflexive polarization of U.S. domestic politics, then we're just going to hand a powerful tool to other people and like refuse to use the tool because the tool is like seen as right wing, and those people are going to get a lot of power. They're going to gain a lot of power and ability to organize. They're going to have a lot more dexterity in dealing with the future. And I think that left-leaning people, they will ignore it or fight it for a amount of time, and then eventually they'll have to adopt it, like the internet generally, and they'll be at a disadvantage. They'll be set back
Yeah.
in their ability to wield it effectively.
Yeah. I think I tweeted this a while ago, but like the left is still so fixated on just Bitcoin or like Dogecoin, Elon Musk tweets, price speculation, like all of the things that are sort of like, yeah, the distracting stuff. I guess it's what's a bit annoying, like the stuff that like what
Very distracting.
who gives a shit, it's you need to look past that a bit, but maybe it's a bit difficult for people if they already have a negative connotation.
Yeah. Who gives a shit about the price of Bitcoin or the price of Dogecoin or the existence of Dogecoin or any of these things? The price does not matter. Like that's not what's important here. Like I said earlier, it's like what you can build on, what you can do with it. There was an article in Current Affairs, which is like a left-leaning publication in the U.S., and
Yeah.
it was about Bitcoin, and it's sort of like it said that cryptocurrency is a giant fraud. That was the title of it.
Yeah.
And it kind of was only about Bitcoin, and like it made like very surface level arguments about it. It didn't really engage with the technology itself. And the author is very talented, like very good, like at making arguments and so forth. But I fear that it's sort of like these very sweeping categorizations or determinations and publications people find influential will dissuade people from curiosity about it, and then they'll miss out on a lot, or they miss out on a lot that's possible. If you talk about the internet in 1993, you can make a plausible argument. This is just like internet's a scam. The internet's just for porn, and it's for a lot of scam artists and people stealing your money and things like that.
That was made. Those claims were
Totally,
made,
totally,
absolutely.
exactly. Yeah, people were making those, and eventually, like time passed, and they had to just you adopt it early, you adopt it late, but you end up adopting it because it just is a superior technology, or it's a technology which had great power inherent to it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just a matter of time, and like the sooner that you get your head around it, the more you'll be able to use it for productive ends. Like, look, I'm not a coder. I'm not like I don't know Solidity and these other like languages to effectively do this, but I know a lot of people on the left are, and like they are very adept with the intimate how to program technology and how to code in a way which is very effective. And I can tell you why I see this being important in a macro political sense, in a way of a tool for potentially reaching economic justice for people in the United States and also in the developing world. But I can't actually. I'm only one cog in a giant machine of people, and like everyone has to do to each of their ability to their need. Like that's the phrase. It's actually kind of true. Like there are people, like a lot of people who have like good intentions, egalitarian intentions for society. They need to use the technological tools that are available to them in the 21st century, and we need to also get over the nostalgia for the 20th century and the forms, the political forms, and 19th century, the political forms which and the tools which characterize those periods, because there's a lot of nostalgia. Like, how is a left wing goal, how are left wing politics to be achieved in Europe or the United States? Are we all going to form like a mass party bureaucracy and, rush to the town square and like declare the end of history or something like that? I mean, maybe, like, I just don't really think that's necessarily like there was a certain information environment which led to those sort of like there's a stage that was set that led to that kind of those kind of behaviors, and the information and technological environment of the 2021 is very different today. It's completely different. We're not in a newspaper world anymore. We're in an internet world, which produces different political outcomes, and it offers a lot of opportunities. So let's like be forward looking. And when you think of the word progressive, but the word progressive, it also says something about technological progress. And the word conservative, I find that to reject this is very conservative in a way. You're trying to hold on to the forms and beliefs of the past, and I think that ultimately it's not sustainable.
Yeah. Just to comment on the current affairs thing you talked about. It was just funny because I was interviewed for a piece that they did like maybe a couple months before that, for a left wing case
about
for
the same subject.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not about. I mean, he focused just on Bitcoin, but I mean, this. I had the journalist on for an interview as well, but he wrote about. I mean, just about the crypto space in general, and interviewed me for it, and then I mean, the guy, I mean, yeah, Nathan, I mean, he just sort of, I don't know, this is about this topic. I think he just like completely throws out everything. He threw out what his own magazine published, and then had his just, I mean, had his own thoughts, I guess. But yeah, I mean, normally he's a smart guy. He's a good writer, but good.
They interviewed you for the same piece?
No, I was interviewed for a previous piece, like
A previous piece. Oh, I see.
for, or I mean, one piece in the magazine and one piece online, and then yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It was very like it's very simplistic. It's hard to make these sweeping statements. I'm not saying
Yeah,
it's a panacea either. I'm not saying like
yeah,
it's a but
no one
also
is.
says it's all fraud. Like it's
Nobody's
also
saying
like
is.
very it's a very extreme statement. And look, I mean, I say another thing too about banks in the United States. Like people, like my formative political moments in my life were like the Iraq War, the bailouts, and then Occupy. Like those
Yeah,
were the things that really resonated with me. So I really like, I have a deep sense of the corruption of these institutions and the unjust sort of power and access that they wield over the rest of us. So, Satoshi Nakamoto in the Genesis block of Bitcoin, he actually quoted reference to the bailouts. So I don't necessarily agree with all the economic theories underlying Bitcoin, but I do understand the impetus behind that action. And Bitcoin's created in response to the bailouts in the end, how angry people were, the absolute criminality of the banks and what they did and how they got away with it without consequence. So, are we still against those institutions, or are we basically supportive
yeah,
indirectly of the status quo in which they benefit? And I think that if you are, then we should shut down every technological advance which even theoretically threatens them. And if you're not, we should explore and keep an open mind about those things. And that's why I'm trying to do that.
mm,
And if we close off lines of inquiry or just dismiss it just perfunctorily like that, we're not going to be able to really effectuate any change. We're going to be very parasitic on liberalism, which at the same time we're denouncing. We're sort of just extend like
yeah,
a more edgy version of liberalism,
yeah, yeah.
and that's a dead end.
Yeah, sometimes like what sort of maybe scares me a little bit is that I've just seen a lot of comments about Bitcoin where it's sort of just like, well, I can do that with my bank. I can do that with my bank for cheaper. Why does
Yeah,
it matter?
yeah,
It's sort of like
yeah.
you're putting the bank in like the progressive position here for some reason, which I think is like, yeah, a bad move. I don't know. They like put themselves on the side of the
Uh,
bank.
Unbelievable for someone who's lived through the bailouts and Occupy. It's
Yeah,
unbelievable level of conformism, and deference to power, which is evinced by these statements. Look, and I'll say something like culturally, maybe Americans are just too conservative, like inherently, like all leftists, liberals, people on the right, they're all actually conservative in a way. They're attached to the American way of life, which you go to the bank and you talk to get the mortgage from the banker, and like he does whatever he wants to do behind the scenes, and then comes back to you, that type of thing. Credit cards, stuff like that. They just like they like it actually. They're used to it. And okay, let's just take that as a given. I think it's like hopefully it's not the case, but let's just say that's a given. In most of the world, most of the developing world, people never had access and do not have access today to that financial infrastructure. There's no banks. They have no, way of getting loans. They have no way of storing the value of their labor. Like billions of people live in societies like this. People are very smart. They have like they're very industrious. They have a lot of ambition, but they're hamstrung by the lack of access to financial services, which we here have become culturally accustomed to, even if we gripe about their corruption and so forth.
mm,
Now, those people in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Asia, they may not have banks because the society did not develop in that direction, physical infrastructure like that. But they have cell phones. Like they have a lot of cell phones, and by the year 2025, it's estimated that 75% of people on Earth will have a smartphone. Smartphone is the only technology that get access to blockchain technology or blockchain ledgers like Bitcoin or Ethereum or others and so forth. So those people, they're people who are building DeFi, like decentralized financial tools on top of blockchains all over the world. Those people could leapfrog the whole physical banking stage that we went through. I don't think they're ever going to go to that stage because first it will take a tremendous amount of resources to do that. There's not really a supportive regulatory environment or resources even to do that. But these people can do it on their phones. They can just access to decentralized finance on their phones. and they're very ambitious. Because they lacked other tools, they were always trying to get ahead. They will just, in my opinion, leapfrog and just do that. They will start utilizing every tool they have. You mentioned we talked about Iran earlier. I have a lot of friends in Iran who are so knowledgeable about crypto, more knowledgeable, average people, but more knowledgeable than the average person here by far, because they had to be. They had to sort of they had live under
Yeah.
a surveillance state at home. They're sanctioned internationally. They have really little options if they want to try to advance their lives and make do the normal transactions we all try to do. So by necessity, learn more about this stuff. And I know people in Pakistan and other countries who like the idea they store the value of their wealth, value of their labor in gold and things like that, things which are easily lost, confiscated land. A lot of people I met who were refugees from Syria, they lost all their land, which was the lifetimes of investment because they had to flee. These are not ideal forms of investment, and I think that the world's not necessarily at the point of culturally accepting Bitcoin yet or crypto yet. But it's I can you can clearly see if you study that it could serve this purpose, and if it can serve as a decentralized store of value accessible by phone by anyone in the world, regardless of your religion, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, language you speak, that solves a gigantic problem. It actually levels the playing field a lot. And, if you're never going to have a bank, like most people probably aren't in the world, or billions of people are not going to have banks in the way we think of banks in the future, but you can have access to everything a bank provides on your phone, that solves a big problem and also saves a lot of resources too. In the world. Talking about the energy expenditure of Bitcoin, I think it's a legitimate area of discussion. What's the energy expenditure of the banking system in the U.S.? Like, what is it exactly? Like gigantic physical infrastructure, the force which is used to sustain it, logistical infrastructure. Like, let's calculate
The
that. Let's
investments
calculate.
in the pipelines that are bursting in all parts of the country, and the new
Yeah,
oil
absolutely. Yeah,
exploration.
the graft and corruption which inevitably ensues in such an opaque and privatized system. What's the expenditure of that? Like, what's the carbon footprint of all that? What's the social externalities of all that? Let's calculate that as closely as we do the energy expenditure of Bitcoin. Maybe it's like bigger than 90% of the countries in the world. It could be. It's not impossible at all. Let's not. The incumbent. One of the privileges of being incumbent is you can make your own costs seem natural, whereas the
Mm.
costs of anything new coming along seem like this unwarranted and unconscionable intrusion on the way we do things around here. That's really unfair. That's like a tool of power. So, I think we should not be we all care about the climate crisis, energy expenditure, and green energy, but let's not be triangulated into defending certain forms of far more egregious energy expenditure and social and environmental harm, just to defend the incumbent.
Yeah.
Let's think critically about this.
Yeah. Just because it's like maybe the system that you are currently reliant on, maybe the slight bias because you have a bank account.
Yeah, it's a very blue pilled, take a Matrix analogy, it's like a blue pill. You just accept that all this is normal. Like, except like there's a currency which is upheld by the force of like aircraft carriers and military bases for everyone in the world and controlled by a very small number of people. And if you want to take like a culturally progressive view, like a small number of like white people in America, white guys in America who are old and have a lot of power. I don't take that framing with people who resonate with people. Like, that's the reality today. Like, how is that a just system to uphold and defend at all costs and to quash any even theoretical challenge to it that undermines it at all? I think it's very unfair. I think it's not good. And we don't want to replace one hegemony with another either. We want a truly fair and egalitarian system. And it could be, there are technological tools which could help facilitate that. And we should keep an open mind about that.
Ah, amen, brother. Maybe I would be really interested to talk about like some of the specific implications that I think, or that I would, yeah, I would think that there would be implications, of course, like if this increases, like if countries more and more begin to use Bitcoin as a type of form of money for circumventing economic sanctions, like what sort of implication do you think there would be if this were to just, I mean, continue?
Look, today in El Salvador, obviously there's very big news of the government adopting crypto.
Yeah.
It's not totally clear the full, game plan or vision of what they have in mind for this. And I think that there are reasonable questions to be asked about the government and, how this is being implemented. But it's something interesting. It's definitely a significant, like, to go from something which was being talked about on a mailing list of a few cryptographers a bit over a decade ago to a nation state adopting it. It's a pretty big deal. Of course, like Iran and other countries have been experimenting with how to use Bitcoin to escape the US dollar system, which they're very disadvantaged under. I think that if it continues, it's very interesting. Like, we could see a great decentralization of international trade. The US, which has constructed a system which is the central, most important node, could be circumvented in many cases, maybe not all the time, it's not necessary all the time, but cases where it's required. And the more successful that these endeavors are, the more other countries will adopt them. And, politics, it always changes. Like, alliances always shift, either domestically or internationally. There are always new issues coming about. There are always new rivalries and new alliances developing. And the system, the alliances and rivalries and friendships and animosities which exist today are going to be different in 10 years. So countries which are okay with the US dollar system today may not be in 10 years and may not be in 20 years. And in fact, I find the entropy even to be quite likely over time. So all takes place. So when this tool is available and people can see that, if it's working in certain countries, or if, certain countries using to effective ends, it'll be a tool in their toolbox when they need to, get around U.S. Certain U.S. actions. Let's say hypothetically in 10 years, okay, Donald Trump came and screwed up the Europeans' deal with Iran on the nuclear file because of the election in the U.S. Let's say in 2030, I don't know, Donald Trump Jr. is elected, or like Eric Trump is elected president, and then he just does the same thing again to
Mm.
uh, European Iranian trade. And at that time, European Iranian trade maybe gotten a lot stronger because had all these years of building up behind it. And the Europeans could be very antagonized again. Last time when they were antagonized, they created Instex, which was like a special body to function European Iranian trade, insulated from U.S. surveillance, other pressure. If by 2030 the technology underlying blockchain and perhaps Bitcoin has been further legitimated and advanced at that time, they may very well say that we have a problem now. Let's use this tool, which obviously works in other contexts. Let's just use it, and it's very easy to apply. In fact, because it's already been built out and developed by others in this time. And actually, they could have done it even in 2015. They could have done it, sorry, in 2016 when they started after Trump was elected. But there was less confidence and less familiarity behind it. I expect that, I'm not totally sure, and I think there are some black swan events which come about to negatively impact Bitcoin. But I do think that it's not impossible that it continues to develop as a tool of international trade. And blockchain, it's certainly going to develop and be used as a tool of international trade and other applications of it. Um, so I just think that the more that we see successes and localized cases, the more you're likely to see wider international adoption, because it just solves the problem.
But I guess that also, I imagine that almost signals like I mean, it chips away, I feel like, big time at US hegemony. And at the moment where it's in this position where it could, I mean, they can print as much money as they want, it can use that power for influence. But if that power decreases, like, does that mean, I would think that maybe countries like El Salvador, I mean, it's a dollarized country that then went to Bitcoin. But if the use of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies sort of chips away at US hegemony, then other countries, I guess, they can just begin to then again have to make their own currency. That doesn't have to be cryptocurrency, but it's, I think part of American hegemony sort of like seems to be a big player in forcing a lot of these countries to become dollarized. I don't know.
So, one thing that is likely to come about in the future is that the digital dollar will be created in the US, and a digital yuan is already being created in China. And you creating a digital currency is like digital state-backed currency. The term is a central bank digital currency, CBDC. And effectively, it's like you're taking physical money out of circulation entirely, more or less. And this is money which you can have rather than with a retail bank intermediary. You can have it your bank account with the Treasury Department, and the government's directly issuing you money, like the bailouts and the stimulus grants that were given. They could be given rather than given to Chase Bank or whoever as an intermediary. They can just give them to citizens directly. You can implement monetary policy directly, and that seems to be the wave of the future. And in Liz Warren's comments about a month ago attacking Bitcoin, she mentioned this is something she supports as a potential development in the U.S. And I find this to be, in one sense, good, in the sense that, okay, like, it harms the banks, harms retail banks, because it theoretically disintermediates their role as allies with central banks. That's a good thing, and also it could also lead to expansion of financial services to people who, lack bank accounts for various reasons today, regulatory compliance reasons, and so forth. No, that's the good. Now, the bad is that, if you have a state digital currency, you're creating a surveillance state on the scale of, something that's never been seen in human history, like beyond anything that's ever been possible technologically. Because everyone in the world has, is using a dollarized economy, and theoretically has their digital dollars somehow under the surveillance of this Treasury Department, or the other side of the world is all using yuan and having uh, their uh, their banking transactions and finances monitorable and controllable by the Chinese central bank. You know, they could see everything that's going on very easily. They could force spend your money theoretically. They can confiscate your money. They can freeze your accounts, and there's nowhere to run. Like, they'll have total visibility everywhere in the world is digital dollar or yuan, and other countries theoretically could develop their own digital currencies. But developing digital currencies is very hard. You need a lot of state capacity to do that, and a lot of countries will not have the state capacity to do it. Venezuela tried and was not able to actually do this. Didn't have the administrative weight to do this. So if we have a world, which I think is quite likely, of central bank digital currencies, which are run by a few large powers, you're going to see a great, great extension of imperialism, economic imperialism, like a very
Mm.
intimate form of economic imperialism, which can target individuals in very intimate ways, and there's no escape from it, really. Now, in that world, if that you have a world like that where Bitcoin is gone because people regulated it out of existence, so they just, like, progressives in the U.S. and the Chinese Communist Party teamed up to destroy this, then if you are unjustly targeted by a major government in the future, you'll have nowhere to run. There'll be no neutral digital currency to flee from the state-backed digital currencies, which are depriving you of your human rights and so forth. So, I think that
Mm.
that is a very strong reason for Bitcoin particularly to exist. And I've sort of been hedging and saying, I'm not defending Bitcoin completely and things like that. And I do think there are criticisms of it, and I think there, could be replaced. But something that does what Bitcoin does will need to exist in that world. Otherwise, we're going to have inevitably a form of totalitarianism, which will be shocking to us today, and perhaps future generations will come to accept as normal. But it will be a significant setback for human freedom and even the possibility of human freedom once the world is that intensely surveilled on a financial level.
That was, I feel like, a beautiful statement to to end it on. Maybe, I mean, this has been a really great conversation, and yeah, I love the way that you're thinking about it. I think it's a very measured approach, and it's like very, yeah. I mean, the sensible, like the way that you should go about it. It's not like no one's no one here is a Bitcoin maxi. I mean, I even, I don't prefer Bitcoin over other ones, but like, I recognize that for some people it's a useful tool, and it's a useful tool for anti-imperialism in a lot of cases, and for, yeah, for people who are in shitty situations because of a particular government doesn't like them.
Absolutely. Look, if you genuinely are opposed to the system as it presently exists and its negative manifestations, we have to look at the tools and the tactics we have to actually undermine their power in a meaningful way.
Hmm.
And inevitably, in the 21st century, they're going to be technological tools, and they're going to be tools which utilize advances in information technology and the blockchain and digital scarcity that it creates. The possibility of digital scarcity, which is a scarcity, is a key component, a requirement for the creation of currency, for instance. That will inevitably be a tool of that. So, I'm glad. I'm like, well, hopefully, this can be a start of a longer discussion between
For
people
sure.
who are averse to it or are not aware of it, and they can, be points we made in opposition or in favor. But a constructive conversation can go forward beyond, let's just say, let's make it illegal and move on and, like, just forget about this thing, because it's just not
Yeah.
going to happen, and
Yeah.
it's not shouldn't happen either. We should not defend the status quo to that extent.
I feel like the left just shouldn't rely on regulation as like the only tool to fight back against capitalism. Like solely relying on like the regulatory powers of the state as like the only way. I mean, it's completely antithetical to at least radical left wing politics, who they say not to rely on the state and to sort of take power into your own hands and do what you can in your immediate vicinity, I guess.
Yeah, it's very disempowering. It's kind of like demoralizing. Like to just say, let's put it all in the hands of this distant state, impersonal state that's going to take care of everything. Theoretically, it never does, and actually, and it's fiercely. We have all these complaints about how it operates and so forth, but ultimately, deeming the state to be the savior in one way or another of everybody, I think this is like not a very empowering way of thinking about it. And you can organize from the ground up, and it's difficult in some sense. The physical and economic structure of society militates against that, but there are avenues to accomplish that using the ways we do have to connect with each other, which in many ways have been greatly enhanced by accident, almost just by technological advance.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah.
Maybe to end it off, do you want to plug where people can keep up with you and keep up with your work?
Yeah, I write for the Intercept, and my articles on politics and foreign policy run there. But if you want my general commentary, you can catch me on Twitter, and I occasionally blog here and there, and I'll share a link later on Twitter. But yeah, follow me on social media, and let's keep the conversation going.
Cool. Thanks, Murtaza.